This lecture is on recent reforms from the 1980s on. This chapter I've included, which will also be included as a PDF for you to download, it discusses three major successful implementations, and it begins with the Reagan era. It goes up to George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, as well as Clinton. And then I'm going to go outside the chapter and talk about President Obama's Common Core and show you some videos on that. What we see is from the 1980s onward, we see a period of change. Now, this chapter talks about Republicans and Democrats, and it's important to see that after the 1960s, when Sputnik was launched and we had the huge national science movement in mathematics, the 1970s was kind of a coasting period with education, where we had all this influx of federal money, and that kind of went away. And then everyone just kind of says, okay, we're doing okay. I guess we're doing okay. You know, we won the space race. We put a man on the moon, and that's where that is. But by the 1980s, we see a major resurgence of educational reform on the federal level. Keep in mind that the states are responsible for education and educational reform, but the federal government can control the way the states function by the power of the purse. There's going to be three major movements we're going to look at. The first one will be the Back to the Basics movement. So let's just look at the Back to the Basics movement. And the Back to the Basics movement was an educational reform movement initiated by Ronald Reagan. And he did three major reforms, but this one is one of the most successful. The Back to the Basics movement started whenever Reagan started getting reports that he really didn't like. And if you look at this right here, this is a good little timeline. It shows you in 1980, the gap between white minority students decreases, and then this little section right here that says A Nation at Risk is published. That's the pivotal moment in educational reform on the federal level, was A Nation at Risk. A Nation at Risk, you can read up on it, and I'm going to put a video on here as well about Nation at Risk. But it's going to look at Nation at Risk in the past. But A Nation at Risk was a report that was done by the National Commissions of Excellence in Education. So these groups do these reports, and this report pretty much caught on pretty fast. And it was actually supported by the Department of Education, which is federally funded. It said that there was a 110-point drop. It looked at SAT scores, but more importantly, it compared our education standards and our success of our students with nations across the planet. And it said that we were lacking, and therefore we were a nation at risk. Reagan felt that this report was kind of forced upon him. He always thought that the states should control education and how people mandate their systems. But what he saw was that the federal government, especially his own cabinet, had encouraged a report to be done. And that's why whenever you look at the news conference, it was very, very icy. Reagan did not like this idea of a nation at risk. He did not like this idea of federal intervention in the education system. But because of the nation at risk and the report, Reagan had to do something about education. The Bill Bennett, the Secretary of Education under Reagan, encouraged schools to focus on teaching basic materials. And then we start seeing something called the Basel approach actually started coming in. The traditional Basel approach emphasized phonics and accurate pronunciation and reading. So Nation at Risk really started encouraging moving away from whole language and moving towards phonics. And phonics, this is where some of y'all, if you were raised in, if you're as old as I am, and you went to school in the 80s, especially elementary school in the 80s, then you'll remember that you used whole language. You used like C. Dick Run books, and you had to learn words as they went. Well, now, because of Nation at Risk, this new movement called phonics started kicking in, where people learn sounds instead of learning the whole word, and they can sound out each word. California and Texas, by the 1990s, actually declared that whole language programs were complete failures. During the early 80s and 90s, the gap between performance of African Americans whites on standardized tests decreased substantially for the first time. So you see this movement of back to basics of reading and writing and getting back to a new style of learning how to read actually decreased a lot of the gaps. Reagan did state that money was not one of the bigger issues. Reagan averted that something far more than just increased government spending on public education was needed to remedy a nation's educational woes. So money was not the solution to this. President Reagan did recommend 6 steps in his back to basic approach. The first one was that school standards had to be raised. You had to see a complete increase of school standards. The second one called for greater teacher empowerment in administering classroom discipline. The third was called for Americans to take action against a multi-dimensional front to reduce student drug and alcohol abuse. And this is where we start seeing the rise of the Say No to Drugs campaign, especially that was done by Nancy Reagan. The Say No to Drugs. Fourth, Reagan believed that teachers needed to have higher expectations of students. Fifth, Reagan called for a higher level of parental involvement. And sixth, Reagan called for basic virtues or moral character education to be taught. So Reagan really embraces, let's go back to the basics, let's not spend too much federal money, and let's definitely go back to moral and character education. At this point, I'm going to show you a video on Nation at Risk, looking back at it.
Secretary Bell and I first discussed a plan of action to deal with the declining quality of education in America, we agreed that it was imperative to assemble a panel of America's leading educators, an assembly of such eminence that the nation would listen to its findings.
The report states bluntly that the very future of our nation is at risk, sabotaged by a rising tide of mediocrity in our children's education.
Your commission was asked to assess the quality of teaching and learning in America compared with our own educational tradition and the rising competition from other industrial nations. You've taken a long, hard look at America's educational system and found that quality is lacking, but not because today's students are any less capable than their predecessors. We found that our educational system is in the grip of a crisis caused by low standards, lack of purpose, ineffective use of resources, and a failure to challenge students to push performance to the boundaries of individual ability, and that is to strive for excellence.
A Nation at Risk was probably the single most influential document in the history of American education.
Well, it was a bombshell. Nation at Risk hit the country and it exploded. And I think that was against expectations.
I mean, if you think about it, it was just a report, just a few words, and we remember it well today, and it challenged a lot of us. It wasn't a 2,000-page piece of legislation with 50 programs in it and lots of mandates and rules and regulation. One might argue that A Nation at Risk and that phrase did more than all the federal legislation that we've passed.
When that report came out, it became a headline maker, to the surprise of many people. It was the #1 story in papers like the New York Times, and we had made it short enough, a 31-page report, so that it could be reprinted. And so we began a national conversation about the quality of education and the quality of schooling in this country.
Well, the significance of A Nation at Risk is that it set in motion a false narrative. It set in motion the claim that American education was failing. And the great irony of this is that American society, by every measure you can think of, is the strongest and most powerful in the world.
A Nation at Risk called for us to attend to the needs of all our children in much more powerful, more accountable ways. It asked us to look at our schools not just as an institution and as an employer and as a community institution, but literally how well were we doing by our students.
It stirred a lot of people into action, and it was, I think, a great rallying point for people who wanted to engage in school reform.
It was a scathing indictment of the quality of education in this country, including the course-taking patterns of youngsters and the quality of teaching in America and the quality of administration, and generally a negative appraisal of where we were.
I think A Nation at Risk is like a lot of things in education. It's more significant as a touchstone and what it represents than what was actually between the covers.
A lot of other reports were coming out at about the same time saying much the same thing. So in reality, A Nation at Risk was kind of the biggest wave in a wavy ocean.
I think there was a level of truthfulness there that was very appealing to me. There was not a sugarcoating. It was not politically correct. I think there were folks in the political establishment who didn't want the report to come out, but the fact that they talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly, I think is so important.
They were wrong. Their predictions were all wrong. And I think that the alarmist rhetoric, which it's at the time, it seemed to me the alarmist rhetoric was just a wake-up call. It was a way of using language that was overheated to kind of get attention. But it had real-world consequences. For one thing, it began the long march to destroy public education, which I think is now in full flower.
Most of what it had to say was about high schools, but if you read the rhetoric and the releases and you would have no idea that most of what they were talking about only applied to grades 9 to 12.
The administration did not come in 1980 thinking about how do we unleash a transformation of American schools, and it wasn't sort of a top priority for President Reagan. It was a report that got underway. It was there, and there was even disagreements at the senior staff level at the White House about what to do about it. And then the report was released.
Up until 1983, the conversation for many years was mostly around issues of equity. And were also big issues around race and desegregation, which of course were incredibly important. That there was a whole era of what you might call education reform, since Brown versus Board of Education, that was all about desegregating the schools. Suddenly we woke up and realized that SAT scores were plummeting and that students were learning a lot less than they had before. So this was a wake-up call to say, we need a new focus around excellence, around achievement, around results. And 30 years later, it's still the focus that we've got today.
It was an absolutely clear and courageous call to challenge the status quo and not to accept where we were and to not think if we continued on that path that everything would be okay. And I think there's still, frankly, a sense of complacency, a lack of urgency that we continue to fight. And so I think the authors' strong desire was to challenge us to do better, to get better faster, and as much as I felt that 30 years ago, I absolutely feel that every single day today.
I think our schools look remarkably like they did in 1983. The way we hire, use teachers, pay teachers, deploy teachers, evaluate teachers, the way we organize schools, the way we organize classrooms, bell schedule, adopt textbooks. We have gone through several spins of the standard cycle. We have school choice that looks nothing like what one could have imagined in the early 1980s. There are entrepreneurial ventures and various kinds of nonprofit providers in the charter school space and the teacher space who were unimaginable, literally unimaginable in the early 1980s. And for me, these are all incremental steps forward. But, in the scheme of things, if we were on our own 20-yard line in 1983, I'd probably say we're on the 25 or 26-yard line 30 years later.
I think that what Nation at Risk challenged us to do was to take to scale things that we know matter. And, in a nation of 15,000 school districts and, tremendous decentralization and a relatively small federal role compared to other nations, the question is how do we maximize our resources to drive the kind of fundamental systemic change that we need?
I'd say where we have made progress potentially is the fact that the idea of education reform has hit the mainstream more.
The one clear positive or impact of A Nation at Risk is that people no longer think we're that great. I mean, at that time, everybody thought we were great. So the bubble has been burst on the on that inflated view of ourselves. So that's a good thing.
Well, I think there are places that we can point to real progress. When you look at the National Assessment of Educational Progress, at least if you look at the 4th grade and 8th grade results, there have been some big improvements. This happened especially in the 90s, has continued somewhat through to today. It is especially the case for low-income students, minority students, our lowest achieving students, that the focus of standards-based reform and testing, and then No Child Left Behind, all of that has worked to some degree to bring up the lowest achieving students, and we should be proud of that progress.
We are not living up to our promise as a country to be the land of opportunity, to be the place where everybody can get an excellent education and live the American dream, because the bottom line is that if you are a poor kid in this country, or you are an African American or Latino kid in this country, the likelihood that you are attending a failing school is pretty significant, and therefore you can't get a high quality education. You can't become the chances that you could become a productive member of society are lessened because of that, and I think that goes against the ideals that we have as a nation.
One of the things A Nation at Risk did was to put into the atmosphere this absolutely ridiculous idea that schools alone can change society, and that we could ignore poverty, ignore all the factors that affect children and their ability to learn, and to say that the schools alone can bring everybody up to high levels of proficiency. It's never happened in any other country. It hasn't happened here. We now have a status quo of testing, accountability, and choice. The charter movement after 20 years has nothing to show for it. It has some good schools, some horrible schools, a lot of corruption, a lot of fraud, a lot of misuse, and lack of accountability.
It did start that conversation about having higher expectations, more demanding courses. The idea that, look, it shouldn't just be college track kids who can take this more demanding material. It hinted at choice, though it wasn't a big part of the conversation. But when Secretary of Education William Bennett came in soon after A Nation at Risk, that was a big issue for him. He had his 3 C's, the content, character, and choice. And I think it was Bennett and his boss, President Reagan, who really put choice on the agenda.
I think content was the main thrust of The Nation at Risk, and I'm happy to say I borrowed from it, though I don't know that I did consciously. But what it talked about was that students didn't have the proper background, the proper understanding of the key disciplines, math, English, history, science, art, and music, and that they needed to know more and to study more.
We now really do judge a school by whether its students are learning, rather than by how much money is going into it, or what its programs look like, or its good intentions, or its TLC. That's a profound change in how we view schools. We're serious about standards. We're serious about quality. We're serious about benchmarking ourselves, states against states, school against school, country against country. This is all new and is very important. But what do we still have to do? We still have to get a whole lot more skills and knowledge into the skulls of many millions more young people.
I mean, if you look, we've taken some really huge steps against some big opposition. I mean, it took me 1.5 years in a big fight with the largest teachers union to have just the Model T of paying teachers more for teaching well. But today we have teacher evaluation systems being tried everywhere in the country. We have many more children with choices of different kinds of schools. We have charter schools, which didn't even exist in as late as 1990 or 1991. So we understand a lot of the problems.
What the writers of A Nation at Risk had in mind was we want higher standards, we want better schools, we want a stronger public education system. It has become, however, over time, over 30 years, the founding document of the privatization movement. And so in that sense, it was very powerful for school reform in a positive sense. It has become very powerful in a negative sense as the basis for privatization and for the enrichment of a small number of entrepreneurs.
I'm a deep believer that good standards is where education quality starts. Unfortunately, it's not where it ends, because if they're not taught to and so on, they don't do much good. But having a good destination for what you'd like your kids to have learned by the end of 12th grade, and then every grade before that, is a whole lot better than having a bad destination in mind. Having said that, most states, left to their own devices, have come up with abysmal standards, and the Common Core folks have come up with good standards. And so when we did this analysis at Fordham a couple of years ago, we concluded that about 3/4 of the children in America would in fact be better off if their states moved toward the Common Core. It's up to the states whether to do this, but the fact of the matter is that for 3/4 of the kids in America, what is expected of them in the Common Core is superior to what is expected of them in the standards of the states that existed before.
We've seen 46 states just in the past couple of years raise standards, college and career ready, internationally benchmarked. That people thought was impossible, thought it couldn't happen for a whole host of reasons across the political divide, and to see that kind of movement, frankly, nobody predicted. So, the lessons from A Nation at Risk, their call to action, but again, frankly, the lack of action subsequent to that, was that influential in our thinking? Absolutely. Thinking about how we continue to challenge the status quo where we have underperforming schools and turning them around. Very, very important. But we have to raise the bar for everybody. And if you're closing gaps, but everyone's going to a spot of mediocrity, which is what the Nation at Risk talked about, that's not going to help our country get where we need to go. That's not going to keep us competitive. That's not going to keep good jobs in this country. So combining equity, and again, I always try and talk not about achievement gaps, but about opportunity gaps, combining equity with a desire to raise the bar for everyone, equity and excellence, and getting the public to see that those two values aren't in conflict, but in fact are mutually reinforcing. I think that's the only way we get to where we need to as a nation.
Well, we have plenty of work to do because our outcomes aren't anywhere near where they need to be, and the rest of the world is not waiting for us. It is accelerating as fast as it can, and in some cases moving faster than we are to improve. So we are by no means out of the woods on this problem.
I think there needs to be a continuing growth of reality. Even though A Nation at Risk was an alarm bell, and people said, yeah, you know what, we're not doing as well as we should, it doesn't last very long. They're not outraged over it. And sometimes they even get into the, well, we're doing okay, economy's okay, so forth and so on. So it is within our means, but we have a long way to go.
I think we've made a mistake in the reform movement to be obsessed with getting more young people into college, for example. We've had very little focus on preparing students for career with good vocational or technical education, to get credentials that could help them do well in the world of work. These are the kinds of things we need to be focused on so that the middle class and the working class going forward can reap some of the benefits that the more affluent Americans have gained in the last 30 years as well.
My hope is that we really do take seriously what kids should know and be able to do. It's definable.
As a friend of mine said once, the longer you stay in school in America, the dumber you get relative to kids in other countries. Our international standing is not where it should be, and we are, if we were to use the language of that report, still a nation at risk. The risk now is that we're not preparing our students for the kind of competition they're facing.
I think the more we can spell out who's responsible for doing what, talking not just about achievement gaps, but what I call opportunity gaps, I think there's so much more we know now. But for me, at the end of the day, yes, reports are important. Yes, reports draw a line in the sand. Any report, unless it leads to actual changes in behavior, unless it leads to action, unless it leads to real implementation, as intellectually interesting as they might be, if they're not doing those other things, they're not changing our young people's lives the way we need to do.
I think we're at a real crossroads in American education. I think 30 years from now, one of two things will have happened. Either the technology and the infrastructure and the lack of containment around knowledge will really revolutionize our schools. We'll see our best teachers doing the hardest work. We'll see students working at their own paces. We'll see curriculum aligned to their needs. And I think it will be a very, very bright future for American public education. On the other side of the coin, I think it's also possible that this institution will really degrade significantly. I think knowledge can no longer be contained within four walls. Technology has really brought information to people in more powerful ways. And I think we're going to see the potential for our schools to no longer exist as we think of them in 30 years. That knowledge will be outside, it will be privatized, it will be homeschooling, it will be, at your fingertips, and the institution we know today as public education may be a shadow of its former self.
What I'm working towards with whatever years I have left in my life is to save public education and to make public education what it ought to be, which is a good school, good high-quality school in every neighborhood, schools that have small class sizes so that the needs of children are met, schools that have a social worker, a guidance counselor, a psychologist, a librarian, a library, schools that have a full curriculum with history and civics and foreign languages, physical education every day, a vibrant program of the arts, schools that strive to give to every child the same advantages that people get if they pay for a private school education.
Well, hopefully we will be a country that's living up to our promise. Hopefully we will be a nation that if you look at the achievement levels of a school, you can't then say, well, I'm pretty sure I know the demographics of this school, right? Because right now there is such a high correlation, and that's part of the problem. We want this country to be a place where you look at the academic outcomes of kids, and you can't, based on that, make assumptions about what those kids look like or where they live.
What I hope is that our K through 12 education system looks more like our higher education system. By that I mean that we have thousands of autonomous schools. We can call them charter schools. Most of them will be public. And that parents have broad choices among those schools so the school can fit the child, just like we do when we pick colleges and universities. I'd like to see us over the next 30 years, particularly taking advantage of all that the states have done, to begin to move decision-making back out of Washington and let the federal role for education be more like a nation at risk.
Philanthropy's got a role to play. Policy advocates have a role to play. Entrepreneurs, including for-profits, have a big role to play. And you know what? We've got to understand that it's a big, messy, complicated world. And it's going to be another century and another 2 centuries, and we're still going to be massively dissatisfied with the quality of our schools. So rather than ask, can we create, this miraculous system of schooling that we imagine somebody else has, and can we create it tomorrow? We're just going to have to settle in for the long haul, like it or not.
What I think it's done is induce a kind of culture shift or a shift in basic assumptions. It's almost as if the wallpaper had been changed. And we don't have to talk about the new wallpaper after we've lived with it for a few years. But indeed, we're still living with it. So I don't think you'll hear, except on anniversaries and so on, I don't think you'll hear Secretary Duncan or Margaret Spellings or Rod Page talking very often about a nation at risk. But what they spend their day trying to accomplish has been very heavily influenced by it and its legacy.
We're entering a new era, and education holds the key. As sunrise industries grow, they bring us technological advances, offering opportunities and challenges. Rather than fear our future, let us embrace it and make it work for us by improving instruction in science and math, retraining our workers, encouraging their continued education, retooling our factories, and stimulating investment in new areas of growth. We can do that. We can compete and meet the challenges of the marketplace. We're still the world's technological leader. But to be stronger, we have to get smarter. America needs more education power.
Okay, so that was a very informative video on Nation at Risk. And it kind of shows you how important the document was and how it leads to future reform. The negative of this is it creates a legacy of that every president from Reagan on will need to create their own agenda for educational reform. Now, in the past, most presidents just said that each state could do what they wanted to do. But now with President Reagan doing back to basics and other educational reforms as well, now everyone starts saying, well, what is your agenda for educational reform as president? So every president kind of has to create his own. One of the biggest things that the Republicans and the Democrats both argue for is this idea of school choice. Now, you've heard this phrase as vouchers, but what school choice is students being able to go from a public school to a private school or a charter school and taking their tax money with them. So, for example, if you spend $6,000 in taxes, and that's what you pay for your child to go to that local school, would a person be okay if that school is failing to take their tax money in the form of a voucher and take it to another school, even if it's a private school, and have them use that money for their child? So school choice has been a big issue, especially for many years, between Republicans and Democrats. So it's not a partisan issue. It is something that every politician has always argued. The Republican, of course, movement to initiate school choice programs included private schools grew under Reagan, Bush the first and Bush the second, as well as, although the desire for private school choice has never been adopted except at the experimental level. As you read this, you will see something, and it's right here. It says, why is it that American university system is generally regarded as the best in the world, but our public school system is regarded as below average? So where is the need for school choice coming from? It is coming from the argument that competition grows better education systems. So when we have universities like Mississippi State University and all these other universities, they are vying for people's tuition money. So therefore, they try to make a good product. They try to get good professors. They try to create good technology, have online components and elements such as that. However, when we look at public schools, there is no competition. If you live in that school district, you have to go to that school district. So that's where the choice of school vouchers comes into play. If we can create competition among local schools, then we can create good private schools, good charter schools, and good elements such as that. At this point, I need to stop and make sure you understand what a charter school is. I want you to picture a charter school as a flag. And what it does is, a charter school, so you have private schools. Private schools they have their own tuitions, they have their own money that they draw, and they create their own system. A charter school is kind of a private school. However, they receive a charter from the state that allows them to hand out diplomas. But the charter school receives tax money. So that's what the difference between a charter school and a private school is. A charter school is a semi-private school that receives tax-paying money from the state. But of course, they have to receive a charter from the school district to do that. Private schools can operate as they wish, and that's why many private schools are religious, because the separation of church and state is not there in a private school because they're not receiving any federal funds. So, school choice, and as you read this, there is really no solution to school choice. It's always been here and it's always been argued. It's going to talk about experimentation, that some states have tried it. Cleveland, Milwaukee have tried it, and it's been successful for the most part. They also make the stress that African Americans do a very good job when they have school choice. And of course, that's obvious because when you have inner city schools receiving less tax money and they're having issues, then when a student is allowed to go to another school, a better, a richer school, then they're going to do better. So school vouchers do work for minorities, as we see. So school vouchers, there's really, and it's about analyzing possible effects of school choice. The problem is no one has really implemented school vouchers to a full extent because it's going to take money away from local school districts and really destroy them for the most part. Now I have a video from Michelle. You'll see this. What this interview is from the former superintendent of the D.C. school district. Now, the District Columbia School District is it's under a microscope. You have all the politicians there. You have a failing school district right down the road from the federal government's capital. So she took the reins of the school district and tried to run it the way she wanted to. And she found a lot of opposition. And this is an interview to her concerning a movie that came out called Waiting on Superman. Now, I can't show Waiting on Superman because of copyright infringement. But if you ever get to watch Waiting on Superman, it really talks about No Child Left Behind and how it affected many school districts. And they really interviewed her a lot. So they're going to show a clip on her. And what they talk about is magnet schools and charter schools. And what they did was some of the school districts, like in Texas, they were allowed to have charter schools. But in order to go to the charter school, the state mandated that they have a lottery system in which 1,000 students can enter their name into the lottery, and they draw, say, 100 students, and those 100 students are allowed to go to that school. So because there was such a high demand for charters, the state mandated that you had to have a lottery. So that's what they're referring to when they talk about the lottery system. And like, for example, I'm living in a really bad school district. It's really poor, high crime. It's falling apart. Teachers don't want to be there. Well, all of a sudden I find out that Houston's getting a magnet school, which is going to be top notch. It's only going to accept 200 students, and it's going to get taxpayer money. So I'm like, well, how do I get in that school? Well, there's no tuition because it's a public school. Well, how do I get in that school? Well, there's so many people who want in that school, they're going to do a lottery. And that's what some school districts do, is they do a lottery system like that. And that's what they're referring to in this video. So just look at, they're going to do a clip on that, and then they're going to interview her. And she's going to talk about charter schools and teacher unions and how she had some frustrations.
Waiting for Superman. We saw the documentary getting lots of attention all across the country. Davis Guggenheim with this. And you're a featured player in this particular documentary. And it really gets to the heart of what's happening with our schools. And I'll tell you, we're going to play a clip here. And it's an amazing story of this young man named Anthony, who's basically setting this whole thing up where his life is dependent upon the role of a ball to determine what school he goes to. Folks, check this out.
I want to go to college to get an education. If I have kids, I want kids to be in this environment. What? Like around here. I mean, I want my kids to have better than what I had.
I'm just so afraid for him. I cry for him sometimes because I know he can easily be influenced to do things that he shouldn't do.
I stayed back 1 grade, and it was in the 2nd grade. Why? Because my father had passed.
Next year, Anthony's class will move up to junior high. Most will go to John Philip Sousa, which the Washington Post called an academic sinkhole. If Anthony goes to Sousa, odds are he will enter high school 3 to 5 grade levels behind. Anthony's class visits the Seed School, the first urban public boarding school in the country.
To come to Seed, geography and luck, that's it. You have to live in the district, you have to pull out a bingo ball, call your number.
It's bittersweet to me. If I get in, they give me a better chance in life. But if I don't, I just be with my friends.
You see the cages up here. It's a random selection. You all have your numbers, right?
Let's get started. $20. $10.
It was stunning to sit there and you look into this kid's eyes and he understands exactly what's at stake.
Absolutely. If you talk to folks right now at the Seed School where Anthony is, he's thriving. He's doing extraordinarily well.
I saw this piece on Friday in the New York Post. Grade shock, regular schools, top charters. Okay, so you have teachers union quoted, and basically they're saying, see, the regular schools are doing better than these charters, so the charter school movement is failing. When you hear that, what do you say?
it drives me insane. It literally drives me insane because
these are public schools.
These are charter schools are public schools, public dollars, and the same children that we serve. And you know, the unions and other folks really try to sort of say, oh, the charter schools are over there, bad charter schools, that sort of thing. And that's just not the case. Now, are all charter schools excellent? No. But for the ones that are doing amazing things for kids, and in this city we have many of them, right? Not only Seed, but KIPP and E.L. Haynes and DC Prep and other schools that are doing great things for kids, they don't always have the resources that they need to be able to expand and grow. So we should be making sure that those schools can go to scale. In New York City, for the longest time, the successful charters like Jeffrey Canada's couldn't grow because there was a cap on the number of charter schools that you can have. Oh, you can have some good schools, but you can't have too many, right? I mean, that's insane.
You talk about the role of parents in this, but I'm going to throw a little twist in here. President Barack Obama was talking to Matt Lauer, and he talked about not sending his daughters to D.C. public schools. First of all, for you, how important is it for parents to be absolutely invested in this process, and not just say it's upon the teachers, but do you also think it's a problem, even in this city, when you have political leaders, including the president, who talk about public education, but many of them do not send their children to public schools? If they were involved in public schools here, other parts of the country, do you think the school system would be better if their kids were in these schools?
I mean, yes and no. Here's the thing. When I was watching the president talking to Matt Lauer and he gave that answer, because I sort of started to tense up when I heard at Washington, D.C. public schools, and I thought, oh my gosh, what's going to happen now? And when he just straight up said, no, it's not good enough for my kids, I said, good for you. He was being honest. He wasn't giving a political answer and that sort of thing. He was just being honest and saying, no, they are not good enough. Now, he said, yes, they're making progress. It's so good. You know, it's so good that they're coming along, but it's still not good enough for my kids. That's an important thing for people to realize, is that right now, again, going back to always wanting to talk about the good things, we have to face the reality that for many, if not most, of the parents in Washington, D.C. today, the quality of education that we're providing is not good enough for their children. And that is what gives us the burning platform for more. And so I don't want people like the president or anyone else to send their kids to DCPS if they think that they're not going to get the best education possible there. I want them to continue to make the choices that they should. But I also want choice not to be reserved for those who can afford it.
Right.
I want choice to be available to all families.
And I'm glad you mentioned choice. And when I was on Air Force One with the president last year, we discussed education, and I made it clear to him then that I disagreed vehemently with his opposition to school choice, to vouchers. Do you believe that it was still a mistake by the president and Secretary of Education Arne Duncan, and basically following the lead of Dick Durbin, senator from Illinois, to get rid of the vouchers that were established for D.C. students? Do you believe that vouchers should be a part of the overall education conversation and not simply be thrown out because people say, well, if all can't go, then some can't go?
So I look at everything from the vantage point of a mother, too, because I have two kids who are in D.C. public schools. And here's how I see it. When a mother from Anacostia comes to me, and she's done everything right, she said, I looked at my neighborhood school, the results are not good. So I applied to the lottery, and my kids didn't get in. And then she looks at me and says, now what? What can I do? Right? And I don't have a spot for her children at one of our schools that is performing well, a school that I would feel comfortable sending my children to. Then who am I to deny that woman a $7,500 voucher where she may be able to send her children to a Catholic school?
And she's paying taxes.
Right, because she is paying taxes. So even though, people say, well, how can you, be for that program because you lose out when the kid, but this is not about me winning and losing. This is about children getting what they need and families getting what they need. So am I ever going to look that lady in the eye and say, no, you can't have this voucher, you can't go because I need you to help me fix our school? No, because I would never deal with that. I would never accept that for my own children.
Well, we certainly appreciate it. And again, I know, this is a contentious issue. And a lot of people are saying, oh, horrible job, needs to go away. But I think at the end of the day, you have to go back to the most important thing. Have we seen improvement? Are kids learning? Are they getting better? Are administrators and teachers, are they more personally invested? And are we removing obstacles from educating kids? That, to me, I think is the most important thing.
Absolutely.
The last part that we have here is No Child Left Behind. So we've looked at school choice and we've looked at back to basics. And the last one is No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind was bipartisan. And that's something we all need to keep in mind, is it wasn't a Republican or a Democratic item. It was bipartisan. And it really was the climax of the movements that started in the 80s, and where we saw Reagan talking about federal intervention to a limited aspect. And then we started seeing the other presidents talking about school choice. And this chapter also talks about Bill Clinton, and you can read that in this chapter. And when Bill Clinton was president, he really advocated for technology, and he increased federal funding to bring in every school had to be connected to the internet. Not every classroom, but every school building. So he did that, and that was a big thing, but he didn't really stress state testing. But No Child Left Behind is the culmination or the climax of the entire, all these movements coming together, and then we finally get this huge piece of legislation. There is a video that I'm going to show everyone after this, and it talks about the whole Common Core. You'll see that, but it all starts with No Child Left Behind. As many of y'all know, it was signed into law by then President George W. Bush, and it was signed in 2002. What it advocated for was several aspects of it. Bush's goal was to increase the pool of highly qualified teachers and therefore increasing the literacy rate. He also wanted 100% proficiency for all students in reading and math by the year 2014. Students then had to be tested by each state to determine if they had proficiency rates. He also wanted that schools to be ranked in accordance, and if schools failed multiple years, then they would be put on improvement plans where 10% of their Title I funds had to be used for professional development or to help teachers. If a school still failed after the fourth year, it would be placed on a corrective action category. And after 6 years of chronically failing, students could go, it would be under a restructuring phase where the state board would take them over, and students could use vouchers and go to other schools. Unfortunately, no school really failed for more than 6 years because the state board would come in, take them over, and then have them on passing because the state board ranked them, and then they would be back to normal. And then if they got back to normal, then they failed again, then it was a cycle that never ended. So we never got to the voucher phase where students that were failing schools after 6 years would then be allowed to leave. There's been multiple criticisms of the No Child Left Behind. One of the most glaring criticism is the fact that the time could not be met, that this was good for students to have highly qualified teachers, but to eliminate emergency license and eliminate teachers who were not highly qualified. Each state, by the way, had to define highly qualified. The state of Mississippi defined it as 21 hours in your content. But so there was not a time issue with that. So it was implemented in 2002, and by 2014, 12 years into the cycle, everyone had to have a 100% pass rate. Well, if they're phasing out teachers, then the first 2 or 3 years, everyone would be suffering. So that would be the big criticism time was a big issue. One of the most important aspects of it is it takes away failing of its child from the child to the school. No Child Left Behind places the blame of a failing child on the school district. And that's something that's completely new to this society. Unfortunately, because of tenure, and some schools in some states had strong unions, it was hard to get rid of teachers. Another last little aspect here that No Child Left Behind brought in was the idea of merit pay. Would be increasing federal support for schools that were doing a good job and were doing well. The downside to merit pay is you have to actually have money to do it. And the state of Mississippi does not fund education to a level where teachers can receive huge amounts of merit pay. The state of Mississippi did try merit pay, but it was on a very limited basis. At this point, we're going to go outside the chapter, and I'm just going to talk to you, and I'm going to show you a very good little video on what's called Common Core. And I want you to understand what Common Core is. This is outside this chapter. When President Obama took office, he had the option to repeal No Child Left Behind. But in doing so, he would have cut the pipeline from federal funded to education. So he would have to create his own new pipeline of funding for education. So what President Obama did was he allowed exemptions to the 2014 mandate of 100% pass rate. And he said you can continue to receive federal funding of No Child Left Behind, millions of dollars, and you can be exempt from the 100% pass rate in 2014 if you adopt these policies. And one policy was the adoption of a Common Core or national-based standards. The other was merit pay and items such as that. He then tried to use the power of the purse by encouraging what was called the grants called Race to the Top. And Race to the Top grants were huge, millions of dollars of grants to states that would do what he wanted them to do, pretty much, and create their own standards. One standard, of course, was Common Core. Now, several states were selected for the Race to the Top grant. Mississippi was not one of them, but several states were selected for the Race to the Top. What America is expecting is a Race to the Top 2.0, or a second round of grants. And if that's the case, many states are getting ready for that by adopting Common Core. So the federal government has already stated very clearly that Common Core will receive more federal money if you've adopted that. When Governor Bryant, our new governor, took office, he did the State of the State address, and in that he stated that Mississippi should adopt merit pay. By saying that, he was telling the federal government that the state of Mississippi is going to do merit pay, which also aligns with a lot of the grants that they have. He has recently come out against Common Core and saying that the state is going to move away from that completely. So it's a reversal of his State of State address. So this next video is pretty long, but it's going to talk about a nation. It's going to talk about Common Core. It's called Building the Machine, the Common Core documentary. It's going to walk you through Common Core, and if you watch this, it'll give you the whole, you'll have a complete understanding of Common Core. And that's the lecture for today, and I'm going to put an assignment up. I'm going to put the assignment up tomorrow. Have a good day. Thank you.
Jen, it's Suzanne. Just calling to see if you're going to that special PTA meeting tonight. I wasn't planning to go, but Rachel Carpenter said the school is changing the tests next spring. Something about a Common Core standards.
Hey, Steve.
I don't know.
Josh here.
Just really surprised because
I
I've
wanted to
never
see if you've
even
heard anything about those
Anyway,
Common Core standards.
I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Before the fall of 2012, very little was known about the Common Core. The media wasn't covering it. It wasn't a part of the national discourse. It wasn't even on parents' radars. But by January 2013, questions started rolling in. Parents were confused. What is the Common Core? Who does it affect? When did their state, their school district adopt this new reform? But most importantly, why hadn't they heard about it until now?
First of all, viewers should go and look at the standards. They're public,
And I think the best argument for this Common Core are the standards themselves. They're very good. And you go and you read them, and some critics, or former critics, have come in and they've looked at the standards and they walk away very impressed. So I think the best argument is to go and read them for yourself and to make your own informed decision.
In terms of standards, the state-led Common Core State Standards Initiative is developing clear, rigorous standards that will match the best in the world.
Common Core says it is research-based, internationally benchmarked, and you have these boards of education members who were certainly, as I said earlier, motivated well-intentioned. They're educated people, whether they're appointed or elected, and they believe this. They believe that the standards are rigorous, even though they can't tell you what makes for a rigorous or a non-rigorous standards. They simply don't know how to read a set of standards. And this is part of the basic problem.
For the Common Core standards has been a very long time in the making. The need has become increasingly clear. As the United States becomes increasingly mobile, it no longer made sense to have 50 sets of standards. It has become increasingly important for American students to be prepared to compete with students around the globe.
And we worked to create a program initiative called Achieve. It set national standards in a couple of subjects, grammar and math. Now, the program eventually evolved into what is known as Common Core, adopted in 2010.
It is a shift about standards, it's a shift about assessment, because it means they will be equally measured, and it's finally a shift about curriculum.
It sounds good. So why is there growing opposition in Ohio and around the country to Common Core?
Sadly, the very label Common Core has come to be associated with things that I detest.
From Common Core.
As parents, we want high standards. We want accountable schools. But the problem is, this goes well beyond that.
These standards aren't rigorous, just different, designed for an industrial model of school.
And a guy by the name of Robert Small, he was arrested last week at a school board meeting.
Don't stand for this. Fine, you're sitting here like cattle.
Questioning the school's hotly debated Common Core curriculum.
They did try, I think, to cloak some of the activities from the public at large. For example, the development of the Common Core drafts, you would think there would be a public hearing. You would think that public comment would be everywhere. I mean, when we developed our standards in Massachusetts, it took us years because we debated texts, we debated what's going to go into the U.S. history standards, and it was all publicly debated, public hearings, testimony taken. None of that really happened here. There was some public comment, very truncated lists of things came out saying, well, this is the kind of comments we got. There was no clear response to those comments. This is the kind of thing that makes me worry, right?
The states got to look at early drafts, and they got to weigh in on those drafts. And those comments were very much taken as a part of the process of developing those standards. Drafts were also put out for public comment, and I think they received something like 10,000 comments from the public on those standards. So the development of these standards was very much a public process, and it was something that was very much involved the states, both at a political level, but also at a substantive level.
State-led Common Core State Standards Initiative is developing clear, rigorous standards that will match the best in the world. Last month, 46 governors and chief state school officers made a public commitment to embrace those standards.
There are a lot of people that believe that somehow that this is a takeover, a national takeover of what is the domain of local and state governments as it relates to setting expectations. But in fact, these are 45 states that have voluntarily come together to create fewer, higher, deeper standards that when you benchmark them to the best in the world, they're world class. And I'm for that.
The Common Core is a project of two organizations in Washington, D.C., Council for Chief State School Officers and the National Governors Association.
So when you hear NGA and CCSSO did it, what Common Core supporters will say is, see, this shows states are doing it.
Is the Common Core more top-down than the states were already doing by setting their own academic standards? I don't think so. A group of states got together, set these in common.
And that assumes that what the NGA and CCSSO do reflects the will of people in states. That is an extremely tenuous assertion. You know, first of all, that assumes that when I vote for governor of my state, one of the things I'm thinking of is, what's he going to do in the National Governors Association?
You know, what's really interesting about the Common Core in terms of its genesis is we see the same players who were working on this in the 1990s working on it again. You have some of the bit players, like Checker Finn from Fordham has been around it, pushing for this stuff, but the people who've really played a larger role are people like Mark Tucker, who became famous with his Dear Hillary letter, a 17-page letter that described to Hillary how we could transform American education to something that more approximated the German system, which focused on workforce development with great databases that would allow us to pinpoint where we should push kids. Achieve Incorporated. Achieve Incorporated has worked with states for a long time in trying to develop cross-state collaborations, which is a good thing, right? If Massachusetts wants to collaborate with Connecticut, absolutely for it. But they took a larger role here trying to push the idea of creating a Common Core set of standards. And they were funded by the Gates Foundation at a very high clip, as was Fordham.
So if you go back and you look at the history of where the Common Core came from, you'll see that, first of all, it started with groups like ours and some others, like the Hunt Institute, former Governor Jim Hunt, making this case that we needed to have higher standards, and that common standards might be one way to get there. The idea was we would provide political cover for governors and for state superintendents to set the bar as high as it needed to be set. And the thinking was that what was happening before was there was all this political pressure to keep the bar low.
The people who worked on these initiatives in the past, in the George H.W. Bush administration and the Bill Clinton administration, discovered that it was unpopular to have the federal government do this. So Governor Romer of Colorado and former Governor Hunt both came to the conclusion that in order to do this, they had to get the origin. They needed a kind of an immaculate conception of these standards.
And what was the Race to the Top program?
Oh, so the Race to the Top program was a competitive grant program that was part of President Obama's stimulus package. So it was $4.35 billion. And it was a portion of states could apply, and they had to prove that they were sort of doing a lot of the reforms that the Obama administration supported. So things like revamping teacher evaluation, increasing the number of charter schools, and changing their standards. So adopting Common Core or Common Core-like standards played a very large role in that. Yeah, so the federal government played a very powerful role in incentivizing states to adopt the Common Core standards.
Today we crossed an important threshold in education reform. Today we're announcing the draft guidelines for states to apply for the $4.35 billion Race to the Top fund.
Arne Duncan basically, as the Secretary of Education, went to each state and said that each state has a couple of months basically to write a grant to become eligible for federal funding under the stimulus package, federal grant funding. And this was a time when austerity had hit hard in the wake of the Great Recession of 2008/2009. So a lot of states were desperate for funding. So without any real deliberate process, these states wrote the grants, got the really influential signatures on the grants. Now, when they signed off on the grants, they signed off on the Race to the Top mandates.
I'm trying to think of something analogous to this that slipped through so easily on a national basis, and I really can't. That's why I called it radical. You know, it's a real change from the past.
My name, first of all, is Sandra Stotsky, and I was the Senior Associate Commissioner in the Massachusetts Department of Education from 1999 to 2003, where I was in charge of the development or revision of all of our K-12 standards in all major subjects.
I've been a full professor at Stanford for almost 45 years.
And of relevance to a discussion of Common Core, let me add that I was on the Common Core Validation Committee.
I was the person on validation who was directly responsible for overseeing the mathematical core standards were proceeding and their writing and the quality of them.
We had to sign a confidentiality agreement that we would not ever discuss what took place in the meeting itself. This, of course, is very different from all the other civic committees I've ever been in, which were subjected to sunshine laws.
A number of the people that led the writing projects for both of these are now in very high positions. For example, one of them is the head of the College Board, which controls a whole group of exams. These people have not been very forthcoming. They've been very careful in what they say, and I don't think they've given the public any real idea of what's actually going on.
We were expected to say, apparently, that these standards were internationally benchmarked, they followed procedures that were appropriate, a few other things, and I couldn't do that. Then, about 2 weeks later, I discovered there was a report on the validation committee on the website for Common Core. It simply listed the members who were on the committee, and then it listed the names of people who signed on. But when I counted up the number of names, we were missing 5, so that's when I figured out that there were 5 people who had not signed on.
5 out of 30 is a very large number, considering the fact that we were under enormous political pressure to actually sign on.
Numbers you just mentioned tell a clear story, which is why the nation's governors adopted the Common Core curriculum. This new, tougher, more demanding standard of learning is generating a lot of buzz at this time.
And we kind of expected that there would be something like a minority report, or there would be some acknowledgement of the existence of this dissent. And no, there was none. The 5 people who didn't agree to sign the letter simply were expunged from the record. And so it was possible for people in the education world to say that everybody approved of core standards, and indeed they are benchmarked at international standards and so on.
A child walks into a classroom, it should be a place of high expectations and high performance. But too many schools don't meet this test. That's why instead of just pouring money into a system that's not working, we launched a competition called Race to the Top. To all 50 states, we said, if you show us the most innovative plans to improve teacher quality and student achievement, we'll show you the money.
The biggest misconception that Common Core proponents push on people is that there is any evidence that a system like Common Core will benefit children. We have no track record. And the track record we have is points against Common Core. And then people who know about academic content, academic quality, are telling us that Common Core is of poor quality.
Now, I have a lot of respect for Professors Milgram and Stotsky. But their views are very much in the minority, and not just among scholars, but even among those of us who really care about a rigorous, fairly traditional, fairly conservative approach to teaching English and math. And both of them have admitted publicly that the Common Core standards are better, vastly better, than the vast majority of state standards that were in place.
When I talk about core standards with most states, I have to say, you know, as bad as core standards is, it's better than your standards.
I think Common Core is more damaging than beneficial in English language arts. We didn't even get to the question of its 50-50 divide between informational texts and literary texts. It's removing diminishing literary study in the English curriculum, which is what English teachers are trained to teach.
I think that Professors Milgram and Stotsky are making the perfect be the enemy of the good. All right, we believe the Common Core standards are very solid. We don't think they're perfect. We gave them an A- in math, a B+ in English. There were some parts of it that we would have liked to have improved. But you have to understand that the state standards they are replacing, by and large, were terrible.
So why wouldn't we want to at least raise the standards for 90% of the states, and then maybe down the road, in a few years, we can do something else that even furthers that improvement?
How much time do you think we have? I don't know. It's hard for me to estimate. I was thinking initially when I started in on this weird odyssey into education, I was thinking, I know there's a catastrophe coming on the horizon.
This is not your ordinary run-of-the-mill recession. We are going through the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression.
But I also was pretty confident that it was going to be after I was gone. Not anymore. Hidden under the table in the request for proposals for the race to the top money, that $4.5 billion the government is using as seed money to encourage the adoption of Common Core, is a series of requirements that in order to apply for this money, the presidents of the public universities in each state that applies have to sign a letter agreeing that if a student comes to the university or college, as the case may be, from high school, having passed a standardized exam in the content of the basic course Algebra 2, it is not permitted in this, specifically not permitted, to put them in remedial courses.
Everything will align private schools, including charter schools, because they want to get their kids to college. Suddenly, it used to be that ACT could do what the colleges demanded for it. Suddenly, now ACT is going to do, it's actually done already, what the K-12 system demands of it. Same with SAT.
Currently today, over 40% of the students in this country have to take remedial courses in mathematics. And what they're saying in effect is that we can't remediate, we have to give them credit-bearing courses. A long-term effect of that is simply that the credit-bearing courses will drop in content to the point where they fit to what we're getting out of K-12. And that's a severe, what the educators call dumbing down of a system that is the only system that is giving us the long-term economic support that we require.
That I believe we have on this. Thank you. Thank you. The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
For some colleges.
Well, for the colleges most kids go to, but not that most parents probably aspire, right?
It's not for STEM. It's not for international.
That's true. It's not only not for STEM. It's also not for selective colleges that, for example, UC Berkeley, even whether you're going to be an engineer or not, you'd better have pre-calculus to get into UC Berkeley.
But we have to think of our engineering colleges.
And that's
scientific.
That's true.
The Jason Zimba's verbatim testimony to the March meeting of the Massachusetts Board of Education is as smoking a gun as you're going to get. What Zimba is saying, finally and clearly, is this background is barely enough to get a student into a non-selective college or a community college, but everybody gets into a community college. And it is not enough to get into STEM, but more than STEM, it's not even enough to get into a selective university.
You're touching precisely on the weak spot of the Common Core. Nobody knows if there is such a thing as being at the same time college and career ready. Maybe there are two separate goals. Nobody knows. In fact, the National Assessment Governing Board tried to answer this question around 2008, and there was a big technical panel studying this exact question, whether there is a possibility of having a single test showing whether a student is both prepared for career and for college. They came back and they said, there is no research about it, we are not sure, we need to study it. Half a year later, the Common Core came along and declared by fiat, without any substantiation, oh, yes, we can do it, and here they are. So they put a stake in the ground, supposedly the goalpost for all high school students in America. And they call this goalpost both career and college ready. Now let's be serious. If 100% of students can be college ready, and we obviously politically cannot fail half of them or a quarter of them or 2/3 of them, whatever it will happen, it cannot be real college readiness. It has to be a low-level college readiness. On the other hand, if it will be too low level, people will complain. It will be too obvious, so they have to put it high. Suddenly the career readiness becomes too demanding. So some people will complain it's too low for college readiness, and they're right. It is too low because otherwise half of the cohort will fail. Other people will complain it's too high for the career readiness, and they're right. It is too high for career readiness because otherwise the college readiness will look ridiculous on its face. It's an untenable position. It's a change of the way we used to run our lives in our society. Some kids wanted to go to college, and they took the college prep classes in high school, and they would go to SAT or ACT or whatever other tests they did, IB, AP, and they will be college ready. They will prepare for college. Other children did not, and they would fill up later if they're late bloomer, that's fine. But declaring by fiat that everybody will be career and college ready looks like an untenable goal, and that's exactly what you see, this schism. Well, is it too high? Is it too low? Does it make sense? The truth is it makes no sense. But that's it.
I had about an hour phone conversation with David Coleman. He asked to talk to me about the Common Core, and I was happy to listen to him. And there were some ideas in there that if I was running a public school system, I would think were basically a good idea. But what I did say to him is that, the difference between his approach to education and my approach to education is he thinks he has some good ideas about how to do education. And I think in the homeschooling world, I have some good ideas about how to do education. The difference is he's trying to use the force of law to require everybody to implement his good ideas.
The central planning is simply people who like power, who think they're an elite who knows how to run other people's lives. And I grew up differently. I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts that had an open town meeting, and I loved it. The idea that you have independent citizens who choose for themselves how to govern themselves. That was Lincoln's idea. That was what he was fighting for. How to make sure that self-government as a concept endured because the Union had to endure. That was what was the great idea that came out of the Constitution and that Lincoln was impressed by. It was the first country that was really based on that premise, that people were capable of governing themselves. They didn't need a monarch. They didn't need a dictator. They didn't need central planners. It's a hugely powerful idea. And we've almost lost sight of it.
%22% of ninth graders do not finish high school. That's 1 out of 5. The more we have these stringent Common Core requirements, we're going to have more people walking around without a high school diploma. Texas has opted out of the Common Core. And, I'm going to tip my hat to Texas. In Texas, you have alternative high school degrees. You can have one high school degree that really preps you with 4 years of math and everything for University of Texas, Southern Methodist, so on. You can have a regular college, semi-college diploma, and then a third diploma is a kind of general diploma.
Obama administration, Duncan, they don't like that approach because it leaves things up to kids' choices. They want a centralized system in which things are directed by people like them who think they know better for what's good for other people's children. But alternate high schools are what other industrialized countries have always used. Little Finland, for example, over 50% of their kids choose to go to Voc-Tech high schools. Less than 50% go to their academic high schools, and they have about 8 different tracks in their academic high schools. But most countries see that as a way to capture adolescent motivation.
To have one standard for all is a total dead end, and it's also stereotyping people that everybody will go to college and everybody wants the same kind of career and everybody has the same abilities and interests, and you're not worthwhile if you don't do this. This is crazy.
If you have a lot of local control, people can experiment, try out, and to see which one is better. So this whole concept of laboratories of democracy, laboratories of education, you basically stifle this. But then there is a second aspect, which has to do with whose child is it? Is it the government right to teach the child what the government thinks the child should know? Or is it my child and I should have some say in it?
My real concern, I know this sounds trite, it's been said so many ways, is that McGraw-Hill, Pearson, Gates really regard education as a production line in which they're going to take little human beings and make them college or career ready. Come on now, they're human beings. There's more than college and career.
Well, I think the purpose of education is for a person to discover what they're talented at, to discover who they are, to grow it as an individual and as someone who can think, to create someone who's articulate, someone who can be a lifelong learner, someone who can be successful in life. And that means communicating, it means learning, it means passion, being passionate about what you've decided to do and discovering what you've decided to do. I think current policymakers, unfortunately, see the purpose of education as being training people to acquire the minimum level of skills that are required to work in a technical workplace.
To compete in a world that's incredibly competitive, where people are very aggressive in seeking competitive advantages, we have to play this game as well and win.
But identifying common standards is just the starting point. We'll only know if this effort has succeeded when the curriculum and tests are aligned to these standards.
They have to teach to the standards or the kids won't get the right scores. And the right scores is not the point here. They're trying to quantify everything, and this will make it all right. We'll be a brilliant nation. No, we'll be a nation where nobody's brilliant. Every person has a different talent, a different ability, different interest. These are living, breathing people. Every prominent person in this nation, in politics, in government, in entertainment, in law, followed a passion and was brilliant for something. They weren't all mushed out to be the same. And once again, some of the most famous, richest people in this country were terrible students with terrible test scores who struggled through school. But that wasn't the be-all and the end-all of their lives or their judgments about them.
In the core standards, there's a shift, as we talked about, in that not only ELA teachers, but also historians and scientists are equally working with students to develop their ability to read and write. But in the ELA classroom, which often has had domain over stories, drama, and poetry, the typical areas of literature, a new kind of text is entering for the ELA teacher. It's very exciting for them.
David Coleman was a nice man. He treated me well. It was a cordial conversation. It was very professional. I don't agree with his approach at all. I don't agree with his philosophy. I think that on balance, his proposals are not for the good of the public schools. They certainly aren't good for homeschools or private schools, but you know, I have some criticism there. But the man's motives, I don't think we should be attacking people for their motives, because he wants to try to improve the public school system. He genuinely believes that systemization and centralization and data collection are good things for kids.
I think it's a genuine attempt on the part of the authors to produce something which outlines the mathematics that students have to know. The trouble is, you can't do something this radical, where you're cutting out chunks of the mathematics we've done traditionally for well over 100 years, without having some research that says how it will work. And there isn't such research right now.
It sure is an experiment. Why? Because it's national. Hey, we've got a national test called as SAT, Scholastic Assessment Test, or ACT, American College Test. Those are national, but those are voluntary. But this is to be, compulsory.
Somehow, all I hear now is we've got to keep up with China, or we have to win the race. What race? The race is to keep the democracy alive and vibrant and safe, and to have thinking, caring, intelligent students.
At the end of the day, you really have to decide this. Is education about my child and my children, or is it about the system?
Don't stand for this. You're sitting here like cattle. You have questions.
I always liked William Buckley's remark years ago, I'd rather be governed by the first 100 names in the telephone directory than 100 faculty at Harvard. In other words, the common person has better common sense than 100 faculty members at Harvard. So this is what self-government is about. You don't elect monarchs or Plato's philosophical elite. You listen to each other's point of view and you rationally work your way through. But we don't have people who want to articulate that at the top level. And Common Core is just the opening wedge. It sounds innocuous, it sounds good. Why shouldn't we have, same math standards in every single state? But then it turns out that at the high school level, they're about 2 grades lower.
This is a highly diverse nation. We have people growing up in the heart of big cities, people who will never be in a big city, people on farms, people on reservations, people whose whole lives will be spent in agriculture, people who really don't want to go to college, people who don't need to go to college. We have kids who come to school at the age of 4.5 or 5, never having seen an orange or a rabbit. They really don't know their own names. And their childhoods have been total tumult. And the waffle plate is being put over them and they're supposed to learn. I especially love the fact that districts, mine included in St. Louis, are being punished because the kids don't come in and keep up. And a friend of mine as a teacher said, I don't get it. If they're all getting the same lessons, why aren't they all making the top standardized scores? No matter what their childhoods were. I couldn't answer. I was so dumbfounded. Because they're not apples, they're people. They're not going to come and not know how to focus, half the vocabulary, how to respond to an adult, ever being addressed directly, ever having a meaningful conversation. They're scared, and you're worried about your test standards.